Corrupt cop tries to intimidate a veteran at a gas station. Then 4 black SUVs arrive for him. The sun baked down on the asphalt outside the gas station off Route 12, just south of Chapel Ridge. The kind of small town where the wind carried dust instead of news, and where the gas pumps beeped louder than the gossip. Inside the convenience store, the air conditioner struggled to keep up. It wheezed and groaned, rattling through its duties like an old soldier doing one last patrol. There were only 2 people inside, a young cashier with a nose piercing and a woman at the back, scanning a small shelf of canned soup. She wore a faded flannel shirt, boots older than most people in town, and a worn denim cap that said Montana in crooked white letters. Her name was Eleanor Hart, though no one in town really knew that. To most, she was just the quiet woman who lived in the woods past Miller's Creek. Alone. Always alone. She didn't say much. Came into town once a week. Bought her groceries, filled her truck with diesel, nodded politely, and left. Never stayed for small talk. Never picked up the paper. People said she was strange. Others whispered she was hiding from something. They weren't entirely wrong. Eleanor had a limp in her left leg. Subtle, almost hidden unless you were trained to notice. She moved slow, not because she couldn't move fast, but because she had nothing to prove. In her right pocket, folded so many times the edges had nearly disintegrated, was a photograph of 4 men and 1 woman in camouflage, smiling in front of a Black Hawk helicopter. The woman in the photo, leaner, younger, her hair shaved close to the scalp, was Eleanor. That picture hadn't left her pocket in over 17 years. The bell above the door jingled as a man in a crisp uniform stepped inside. Deputy Dan Tolbert, late 40s, broad chest puffed with authority, aviator sunglasses indoors, and a badge that hadn't been polished, it had been buffed. He looked at Eleanor and frowned. "You still living out in that dump behind Miller's?" he said, loud enough for the cashier to flinch. Eleanor didn't look up. She placed a can of chili in her basket and walked calmly toward the front. "I'm talking to you," he added, stepping in front of her path. "You can't just skulk around town like some vagrant. You got ID on you." Her eyes finally met his. Calm, unshaken, the kind of stillness that made lesser men feel loud. "Why?" she asked, voice like gravel and wind. "You check in IDs on soup now?" The cashier stopped scanning. The air felt heavy. Deputy Tolbert stepped closer, dropping his voice, trying intimidation. "You give me attitude again, and I'll find a reason to haul you in. Trust me." Eleanor didn't blink. She reached into her wallet, pulled out a weathered, tattered military ID. She laid it on the counter without a word. Tolbert stared at it, confused, then smirked. "That's ancient. Doubt that still holds weight." Outside, the sound of tires rolled over gravel. 1 black SUV pulled into the lot. Then another. Then 2 more. Eleanor didn't look. She just kept scanning her groceries. Deputy Tolbert turned his head slightly as the unmistakable hum of engines filled the lot. The cashier leaned to peek past the dusty glass door. 4 identical black SUVs. No markings. Windows tinted so dark they seemed like voids on wheels. The engines shut off simultaneously. Eleanor didn't glance outside. She slid a $10 bill across the counter. Tolbert's eyes narrowed. "Friends of yours?" She didn't respond. The cashier's hand trembled as she took the bill. You want a bag, ma'am?" Eleanor offered a slight nod. "Paper." Tolbert stepped back, his posture stiffening. "You can't just waltz around town pulling out expired badges like they still mean something." Eleanor turned to him then. Not in defiance. Not with aggression. Just a steady look, like someone who's had to make decisions no man like Tolbert could understand. "Some things don't expire," she said quietly. The cashier handed her the bag with both hands. She nodded once and turned to leave. That's when the first SUV door opened. A tall man in a tailored gray suit stepped out. Black earpiece. Clean cut, salt and pepper hair. Government air. He scanned the lot like it was a battlefield. Then the other doors opened, one by one, revealing 3 more individuals, each dressed differently, but walking in formation. Not hurried. Not casual. Controlled. Tolbert straightened his belt. "What the hell is this?" The man in the gray suit stepped forward and walked right past him without a glance. Straight to Eleanor, who was just outside the gas station doors, groceries in hand. "Ma'am," he said, standing still, posture squared like he was in a formal briefing. Eleanor looked up at him, then gave the faintest nod. "Clark." The man smiled, but only slightly. "We were in the area. Heard a ping on the ID scan." Tolbert stepped between them, his voice louder than necessary. "Okay, I don't know what's going on here, but—" Clark turned slowly. "And you are?" "Deputy Dan Tolbert, County Law Enforcement. This woman's been loitering and refusing to comply with identification." Clark raised a single eyebrow. "You ran her ID?" Tolbert shifted, unsure. "Not officially, just, she flashed some old badge. Looked fake." Clark stepped in close. "That old badge belongs to Eleanor Hart, former Delta Force. 3 tours in Kandahar. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and, more importantly, still under protection of classified clearance." Tolbert's face twitched. "She lives in a shack with no plumbing." Clark's tone didn't change. "And you live in a world where you don't ask why." Eleanor sighed softly, stepping off the curb toward her truck. "I didn't ask for backup," she said. Clark responded, not looking at her. "Didn't say you did." One of the agents approached quietly, a younger woman with a sidearm Eleanor instantly noticed. Safety on, triggered discipline clean. "Ma'am," the agent said gently, "we can stay until he leaves." Eleanor shook her head. Let the man find his own way back to humility. She opened her truck door, loaded her groceries. The gas station was silent. Even the pumps had stopped beeping. Clark turned back to Tolbert. "Next time you think about flexing a badge, remember that some people earned theirs with blood." The SUVs didn't move. Not yet. They sat like sentinels under the late morning sun, windows dark as obsidian, engines silent but ready. Eleanor climbed into her rusted pickup, a '94 Dodge with chipped paint and more grit than horsepower. She didn't start it right away. Inside, she stared at the wheel, her fingers tracing the faded steering leather. A flicker in her eyes, something almost imperceptible. Not fear, not anger. Memory. Back outside, Tolbert fumbled with his radio, but no words came out. Clark remained still, posture controlled like a man who didn't waste motion. One of the other agents whispered something into an earpiece. Another kept eyes on the road, scanning. Tolbert finally found his voice. "So what, y'all Secret Service?" Clark didn't bother correcting him. "She left that world behind," he said, "and she's earned the right to be left alone." Tolbert, deflated but unwilling to surrender dignity, straightened his spine. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," Clark said. "You should have asked before assuming." In the truck, Eleanor finally turned the key. The engine coughed to life. She didn't pull away just yet. Instead, she reached over to the passenger seat and gently picked up an old cloth bundle. Inside it, wrapped tight with care, was a metal case, one she never showed anyone. Bronze Star, given without ceremony. Buried with names she didn't forget. Her fingers grazed the surface of the case. Then she exhaled. Out the window, she caught Clark's eye. A silent nod passed between them. Respect. Recognition. Not of rank, but of endurance. Clark returned to his SUV. The agents followed. Doors closed with precision, and in less than a minute, the convoy reversed, turned, and disappeared down Route 12 without a single tire squeal. Tolbert stood in the lot alone now, sweat starting to form at his temples. He looked at the cashier. "You believe any of that?" The cashier, still rattled, whispered, "I think we all just got lucky she's on our side." Tolbert watched the truck disappear into the distance, dust rising behind it. That evening, after the sun dipped low and painted the sky with tired oranges, Eleanor's truck returned to her cabin. The path was long, hidden behind overgrown brush and a metal gate no one dared approach. The cabin was modest, wood-worn, windows clean, wind chimes made from shell casings clinking softly in the breeze. Inside, she set down her groceries, fed the old mutt asleep by the door, and stepped out back to the porch. A mug of black coffee, the sky above stretching wider than silence. She watched the stars come out, and somewhere deep in the woods behind her, a trail of stones formed a quiet path to 5 crosses, half sunk in moss. She visited them every night, whispered each name. And when she did, her voice, always soft, always steady, sounded like the wind through tall grass. There were 5 names Eleanor never said aloud unless she was facing those crosses. Not out of superstition, out of reverence. Jackson, Ruiz, Latham, Briggs, and Cole. Each one had stood beside her through a war most people couldn't pronounce. Not the kind of war fought on maps, but in shadows and silence. Special operations left no parades behind, only scars no one could see. That evening, under the hush of twilight, Eleanor sat cross-legged in the clearing behind her cabin. A candle burned at each cross, flickering gently in repurposed ration cans. Her hands rested on her knees, palms open, a ritual she never explained to anyone, because no one had ever asked. "I had chili today," she murmured. Same brand Jackson hated. "Still don't know why. Tasted like metal," he said. Her voice wasn't sad. It was present, alive in the moment. She looked at Cole's cross. UDVE had a field day with that deputy. Probably would have hacked his patrol car to play country music on loop. She chuckled, barely. Wind moved through the trees. The sound of branches creaking felt like an old friend leaning in to listen. She leaned forward, lit another candle, and spoke only one more sentence. "I still remember the way Latham tied his boots. 3 loops, then pull." It wasn't grief that haunted Eleanor. It was memory. And memory, to her, was a form of duty. Back inside, she locked the door with an old deadbolt she'd installed herself. Reinforced frame. No weak points. Anyone trying to come through that door wouldn't make it halfway before the shotgun in the umbrella stand reminded them they'd chosen the wrong cabin. But she didn't live in fear. She lived in watchfulness. Like a lighthouse. Always quiet, but never asleep. That night, the knock came late. 3 slow taps. She rose from her armchair, walked barefoot across the wooden floor, peered through the peephole. Teenager. Skinny. Local. Face pale under the porch light. She cracked the door slightly. "Can I help you?" The kid stammered. "You're Miss Hart, right? You were at the station today." She didn't answer. My uncle, he's friends with Tolbert, said he tried to rough up some weird mountain woman. But then federal SUVs showed up. People are talking." Eleanor didn't move. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," the kid added. "If I ever laughed at you, or said stuff I shouldn't. People here, we don't know much. But I looked up your name. Online." A long pause. Then he held out a piece of paper, torn from a notebook. On it, handwritten, were 2 words. "Thank you." Eleanor stared at the paper. She didn't take it, just gave the boy a slow nod, like a salute turned inward. He folded the note, placed it on the porch rail, and left. She stood there a long while before picking it up, and for the first time in years, her fingers trembled. By morning, the town had already changed. Not in any official way. There were no press releases, no articles, no public apologies. But the tension had shifted. A few people at the diner whispered about what happened at the station. A trucker mentioned black vehicles in the same sentence as covert ops, and a mechanic swore he saw a government badge that didn't even have a name on it. But Eleanor didn't return to town. She never needed to. At her cabin, she hung the boy's note beside her kitchen window. She didn't frame it, just pinned it next to a faded photo of her unit and a cracked coffee mug with "Foot Brag" printed in half a decal. She stood there a long time, sipping coffee in silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that holds weight. Back in town, the mayor, a tired man with too much hair dye and not enough spine, called Deputy Tolbert into his office. "What the hell happened yesterday?" the mayor asked, flipping through a stack of citizen complaints. "We've got 3 calls about government vehicles. One from a man who thinks the CIA has listening devices in our gas pumps." Tolbert tried to stand tall. "She gave me attitude. I was trying to ID her." "You ID a Delta Force veteran in front of witnesses? What the hell were you thinking?" Tolbert sputtered. "How was I supposed to know? She lives like a hermit. Doesn't even pay for internet." "She doesn't need internet," the mayor snapped. "She's on a watch list. A protected one." The room went quiet. The mayor sighed, rubbing his temples. "You've embarrassed this town." Tolbert opened his mouth, then closed it. He was used to being the loudest man in the room, not the one being talked down to. Across the street, In a quiet library that barely had enough funding to pay its single clerk, a girl named Rachel sat at a computer, reading Eleanor's name. A government article, heavily redacted. A photo of a woman in full tactical gear. 2 words stood out. Operation Quiet Dagger. Rachel didn't know what that meant, but she printed the photo and took it home. Pinned it to her wall next to Amelia Earhart, Rosa Parks, in her mother's old Marine Corps uniform. That afternoon, someone left a folded American flag at the edge of Eleanor's driveway. No note, no knock, just reverence. She found it hours later, beneath the autumn wind. The kind of flag that had once been folded for her, for a moment when she didn't expect to come home. She picked it up gently, held it for a long time, then walked it into the house and placed it in the center of her mantle. She didn't need to know who left it. Some acknowledgments don't come with names. They come with silence. 3 days passed. The leaves on the birch trees near Eleanor's cabin began to turn, not quite golden, but ready. Mornings brought a chill now, the kind that clung to flannel and seeped into bone. But Eleanor welcomed it. Cold was familiar. Cold meant discipline. It kept the mind sharp. She spent her time repairing the fencing along the edge of her property. Not because she needed to, but because doing something with her hands kept the ghosts quiet. Mid-morning on Friday, her truck stopped working. It didn't cough. It didn't struggle. It just died in the middle of the road outside her gate. She sat behind the wheel, silent, eyes on the empty stretch of dirt ahead. Then she climbed out, popped the hood, and stared at the engine like an old adversary. It wasn't long before a pickup rolled by. Blue Ford, mud-caked. Behind the wheel, a man in his 70s with a long beard and a Vietnam vet patch sewn to his vest. He slowed down, recognized her immediately, and pulled to a stop. "Need a hand?" he asked, voice raspy. Eleanor nodded. "Won't start. Might be the alternator." He got out, walked over, peeked inside the hood, and whistled. Or it might be the fact this truck is older than most buildings in town. She smirked, just slightly. The man chuckled. "I'm Reuben. Reuben Kane. You're the one who shut Tolbert up." Eleanor didn't reply. Reuben tapped the side of the hood. "I served in Nam. 3rd Recon. Been back longer than I was gone, and it still feels like I never quite came home. You get what I mean?" She looked at him, a flicker of something soft in her gaze. "Yeah." He nodded slowly. "I know a man who can tow this. Won't charge you. Word's gotten around. You're known now." "I didn't ask for that." "No," he said gently. "But sometimes people need someone to remind them what real service looks like." An hour later, a mechanic from a nearby farm hauled her truck into town. She rode in the passenger seat of Reuben's pickup. Windows down. No music. Just wind and the quiet trust of 2 people who knew what it was like to come back different. He dropped her off at the edge of town. "You okay walking from here?" he asked. She nodded. "Thanks." Before she stepped out, he said one more thing. "If you ever want to come by the Legion Hall, there's coffee, and stories, and people who speak the language." Eleanor paused. Maybe. She didn't promise. But she didn't say no. That afternoon, as she passed the general store on foot, people looked up. Not with suspicion. Not with judgment. With recognition. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just different. Eleanor didn't speak to anyone. Just walked to the library, returned a book, and left. But in that quiet stroll through town, she reclaimed something no badge, no SUV, no confrontation could ever offer. Presence. That evening, the cabin was cloaked in a quiet stillness, the kind only found deep in the woods where the world seemed to pause and listen. Eleanor sat in her modest living room, the fading light of an oil lamp casting soft shadows across the walls. These walls held silent stories, old photographs pinned with care, medals framed with reverence, and dog tags resting on a worn wooden shelf. Each item was a fragment of a life shaped by sacrifice, resilience, and the weight of memory. She reached slowly for a photo resting on the mantel, a black and white image, worn and curling at the edges. It showed a younger Eleanor, strong and unyielding, surrounded by 4 comrades, all dressed in tactical gear, smiles mixing relief and pride. The picture captured a rare moment of calm before storms that no civilian could ever understand. Her fingers traced the faces, memorizing the lines and creases that time had deepened. Jackson's easy grin, Ruiz's steady gaze, Latham's boyish smirk, Briggs' fierce determination, and Cole's quiet strength. Those faces had been her family for years, more than blood, more than words. Many of them never made it home. The room held a heavy silence until a soft, tentative knock at the door broke it. Eleanor's eyes lifted slowly, just enough to see the figure in the doorway. Rachel, the teenage girl from town who had left that note on her porch days ago. The girl's expression was a mixture of nervousness and resolve, clutching a stack of papers and a well-worn notebook close to her chest. "Ma'am," Rachel said, voice steady despite the obvious apprehension, "I've been doing some research on you. On your service. On Operation Quiet Dagger." Eleanor regarded the girl for a long moment. There was something earnest in Rachel's gaze, something that made Eleanor want to believe. Rachel stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. She placed the papers and notebook on the kitchen table, mission briefings marked with red stamps, old newspaper clippings with headlines faded beyond recognition, and letters from commanders no longer alive. Documents Eleanor hadn't laid eyes on in over a decade, maybe longer. "I wanted you to have these," Rachel said quietly, her voice almost reverent. "Not just to remind you, but so the town can know the truth. You shouldn't be forgotten." Eleanor's gaze softened as she ran her fingers over the documents. Memories surged, late nights poring over intelligence reports, silent watches under starless skies, the whispered names of those who fell beside her. The bravery that wasn't about medals, but about the willingness to keep going when everything inside screamed to stop. "Why do you care?" Eleanor asked, her voice low but edged with curiosity. Rachel swallowed, then met her eyes. "Because you're not just the quiet woman living in the woods. You're someone who fought for all of us. And people here, they need to understand that. I want to tell your story, give you the respect you earned." Eleanor nodded slowly. It was a rare warmth that softened her usually guarded demeanor, a flicker of hope, perhaps. Maybe it's time. The two sat together at the kitchen table, spreading the papers out between them. The candlelight flickered, throwing dancing shadows over the pages, binding past and present. For hours, they talked softly, Rachel asking questions, Eleanor answering with carefully chosen words, revealing the person behind the uniform. A woman who bore loss, sacrifice, and unwavering strength. Outside, the night deepened. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying faint echoes that only those who had been to war might recognize. The distant sound of helicopters, the subtle hum of memories that never quite leave. And in that moment, Eleanor Hart wasn't just the woman living quietly in the woods. She was a hero reclaiming her story, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. The morning light filtered softly through the towering pines around Eleanor's cabin, casting long shadows over the worn wooden porch. The chill of early autumn lingered in the air, sharp but not unwelcome. Inside, Eleanor packed a small bag with a few essentials. Nothing elaborate, just enough to make the trip into town. As she drove down the dirt road toward Chapel Ridge, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath her tires marked a path she had avoided for years. Today felt different. The air carried something intangible, a shift, not in the town itself, but in how she imagined it would receive her. The streets were quiet. The general store had its usual hum, but the clerk's greeting was softer, warmer. At the diner, voices hushed when Eleanor stepped inside. The usual stares had changed into subtle nods of acknowledgement. People were beginning to see beyond the weathered flannel and worn boots. Word of what had happened at the gas station and the quiet arrival of those black SUVs had stirred something in the town's heart. It wasn't just curiosity. It was recognition, a dawning respect for the woman who had lived among them, unnoticed yet unbowed. Eleanor walked with measured steps toward the Veterans Memorial, a modest stone monument nestled at the edge of the town square. Names etched deep in granite told stories of sacrifice, courage, and loss. Stories she knew all too well. Rachel was already there, clutching a folded American flag, her eyes shining with quiet pride. A small crowd had gathered, their presence hesitant but genuine. Eleanor approached the monument. She reached into her coat pocket and carefully pulled out the bronze star medal she had kept hidden for years. The medal caught the sunlight, glinting softly as she laid it reverently at the base of the stone. The crowd grew still. A gentle murmur passed through them. Reuben Kane, the Vietnam vet who had helped her days before, stepped forward. His voice was steady and filled with solemn respect as he spoke. "This is what real service looks like. This is honor." Others nodded in agreement, some wiping eyes, others standing taller. In that moment, Chapel Ridge transformed. No longer just a quiet town with dusty roads and wary eyes. It became a place where history and humanity met, where respect was reclaimed and dignity restored. Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence held all the words. As the sun set, bathing the town in shades of amber and violet, she turned and walked away. Back to her truck, back to the quiet life she had always known but now lived with a renewed sense of belonging. Behind her, the town watched. Not with suspicion, not with doubt, but with a newfound respect. The days following Eleanor's quiet recognition at the Veterans Memorial brought a subtle change to Chapel Ridge. The air seemed lighter, the cautious glances from townsfolk grew warmer, and whispers of respect replaced old rumors and suspicion. But despite this newfound acceptance, Eleanor knew the past was a shadow that would always trail her steps, silent, ever-present, and unyielding. One overcast afternoon, Eleanor made her way to the small-town library. The place was quiet except for the soft murmur of pages turning and low conversations among visitors. As she browsed through a shelf, her attention was drawn to a nearby table where two men were engaged in hushed dialogue. Their words were careful but carried the weight of experience. "Delta Force operations aren't just about firepower," one said. "It's about precision, discipline, trust. You either have it or you don't." The other nodded solemnly. "Quiet Dagger was the toughest mission I ever heard about. They went in deep, and some never came back." Eleanor lingered near the window, gazing out at the trees swaying in the breeze. The sun filtered through leaves, casting dappled shadows on the floor. Her mind drifted to distant deserts, the cold of night watches, the sharp echo of gunfire, and the faces of comrades forever etched into memory. Her phone vibrated softly in her coat pocket, breaking the reverie. She pulled it out to see a message from Clark, the man in the tailored gray suit who had arrived with the black SUVs. "Operation Quiet Dagger is far from over. If you need us, say the word." She stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the words. Alliances born in silence and secrecy, bonds formed in battlefields far from home. The kind of connections few could understand. Later that evening, back at her cabin, Eleanor carefully opened the old metal case on the kitchen table. The bronze star gleamed faintly in the warm glow of the oil lamp. It was more than metal. It was a testament to sacrifice, endurance, and the battles fought in the shadows. She poured herself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window, eyes tracing the silhouettes of trees against the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond the woods, the distant hum of engines whispered, a reminder that while her war might have ended, the fight for dignity, memory, and justice was still very much alive. In that quiet moment, Eleanor Hart was not just a woman forgotten by a small town. She was a guardian of stories, a keeper of truths, and a symbol of resilience. Morning broke crisp and clear over the quiet woods surrounding Eleanor's cabin. The sky blushed softly with dawn's first light, and the usual chorus of birdsong filled the air, a gentle reminder that the world moved on, even when some days felt still. Eleanor rose before the sun fully claimed the sky, moving through her morning ritual with practiced ease. She boiled water over a small stove, the hiss and bubble of coffee grounding her in the present. The bitter warmth of the first sip settled deep, a familiar comfort against the chill creeping through the cabin. A firm knock echoed at the door, deliberate and steady. Eleanor's gaze flicked toward the sound, her hand pausing mid-motion over the kettle. She opened the door to find Reuben Kane standing there once again. His face, weathered by decades of sun and storm, carried a new look, something softer, hopeful. "I've been talking to some folks," Reuben said as he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice you heard when someone spoke truths they'd been holding back. The town's starting to change. People want to know more, want to help. Eleanor studied him silently, the flicker of surprise crossing her face quickly replaced by a guarded acceptance. She wasn't used to visitors, especially not with offers of friendship or solidarity. But something in Reuben's presence felt different. Genuine. There's a group of us veterans in town, Reuben continued. Men and women who've walked through fire and come home carrying it in ways no one sees. We'd like to invite you to join us. Share your stories, your strength. It's time we stand together. The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and unspoken wounds. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated. The scars of her past weren't easy to open. The memories of loss, pain, and sacrifice were hers to carry, not to unload on those who might not understand. But in Reuben's gaze, she saw something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of belonging. She nodded quietly. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found herself at the old Legion Hall, a place she hadn't visited in years. The building smelled of worn leather, old wood, and faded memories, a sanctuary for those who had served and those who had come back changed. Around a circle of folding chairs sat veterans of all ages, faces marked by pride and pain, the unspoken language of shared experience. When Eleanor entered, the room fell into a hush before welcoming nods and warm smiles filled the space. One by one, stories were shared, moments of valor and hardship, loss and hope. Hands were shaken firmly, and silent understandings passed between those who needed no words. In the company of these unexpected allies, Eleanor felt the weight of solitude begin to lift. Here, among those who carried their own ghosts, she rediscovered a fragile but powerful sense of belonging. For the first time in years, Eleanor Hart was not alone. The Legion Hall stood as a weathered sentinel against the darkening sky, its walls soaked with decades of stories both spoken and silent. Inside, the worn wooden floor creaked softly beneath the feet of veterans gathering for their monthly meeting. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, pine polish, and faint traces of tobacco, a reminder of battles fought and bonds forged in distant lands. Eleanor arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of deep orange and purple. Her footsteps were quiet but certain as she entered the hall, the familiar space folding around her like a second skin. Faces turned, some curious, some warm, others reserved, but all bearing the marks of lives shaped by sacrifice and endurance. They sat in a loose circle of folding chairs, each veteran carrying their own weight, their own memories. The room hummed with a respectful silence until one by one, stories began to flow. Some spoke of firefights beneath foreign skies, others of the loneliness that follows homecoming. Each voice carried a truth, a piece of a shared puzzle. When it was Eleanor's turn, she rose slowly, her gaze sweeping the room. There were no medals displayed on her chest, no rank insignia to command attention. But when she spoke, her voice was steady, calm yet resonant, carrying a depth that filled every corner of the room. She spoke not of the glory often promised in recruitment speeches, but of the quiet moments that lingered long after the guns fell silent. The nights spent watching over fallen comrades, the weight of names etched forever in memory, and the small acts of kindness that became lifelines in the darkest times. Her words were neither boastful nor sorrowful, but honest, an unvarnished tribute to resilience and humanity. The room held its breath, listening with a reverence that only those who have walked similar paths can know. No interruptions, no judgments, just shared understanding. After the meeting, as the veterans began to gather their coats and say their goodbyes, Reuben approached Eleanor. The stars glittered overhead, cold and distant, but the chill was softened by the quiet warmth of camaraderie. "Not bad for a hermit," Reuben said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Eleanor returned the smile, the first genuine one she had offered in a long time. Maybe not. They stood there for a moment, two warriors reunited by circumstance and choice, before Eleanor climbed into her truck. The engine rumbled to life, a low growl breaking the stillness. As she drove back toward the woods, the quiet town behind her no longer felt like a place to escape. It was home, imperfect, complicated, but hers nonetheless. And for the first time in many years, the heavy weight on her chest felt just a little lighter. The days slipped by like soft shadows through the trees, and the sharp chill of autumn began to settle in Chapel Ridge. Eleanor moved through her routine with a subtle but profound shift in the air around her. The weight she had carried for so long, the silence, the solitude, the feeling of being unseen, had started to loosen its grip. She was no longer invisible. At the local grocery store, the cashier no longer avoided her gaze but offered a small, genuine nod of acknowledgement. At the post office, the clerk smiled warmly, greeting her with a quiet, "Thank you for your service," before Eleanor could speak. On the streets, instead of wary glances, she was met with respectful nods and quiet greetings, little acts that, taken together, wove her back into the fabric of the community she had long kept at arm's length. These moments were small but powerful, each one a thread, stitching a patchwork of acceptance and respect around her, a shield against the long years of isolation. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in bruised oranges and purples, Eleanor was sitting quietly on her porch, nursing a cup of black coffee. The air was crisp, the smell of wood smoke faint in the distance. The tranquility was broken by a soft but deliberate knock at the door. She opened it to find Clark standing there, the man in the gray suit, calm and unassuming. His hands were folded quietly in front of him, his eyes steady. "We're still watching," he said softly, voice low and steady, "making sure you're safe." Eleanor studied him carefully, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through the stoic mask she'd worn for so long. "I'm not the woman you think I am," she said, her voice steady but edged with a vulnerability few had seen. "No," Clark replied without hesitation. "You're better." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them thick with unspoken understanding, the kind only those who have shared battles both physical and invisible can grasp. After Clark left, Eleanor closed the door gently and returned inside, where the flicker of firelight cast dancing shadows across the worn wooden floors. She settled into her chair near the hearth, the bronze star resting proudly on the mantel beside the neatly folded American flag she had received weeks before. The flames flickered softly, shadows stretching and shrinking like memories on the walls. She reached for an old, battered journal that had accompanied her on deployments and quiet nights alike. Opening to a blank page, Eleanor picked up her pen and began to write. Not for recognition, not for glory, but for the story that deserved to be told. A story of quiet strength, of resilience, of a veteran's long journey home. Each word carried the weight of years spent in silence and solitude, now transformed into a legacy of honor and truth. The ink on the page was more than just letters. It was a testament, a promise to herself and to those who came before her that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. Outside, the night settled over Chapel Ridge like a soft blanket. But inside, a quiet victory was being written, one that would echo far beyond the walls of a small cabin in the woods. Weeks slipped by quietly as the autumn leaves surrendered to the first whispers of winter. The days grew shorter, the air crisper, and the woods around Eleanor's cabin settled into a hush that felt both somber and sacred. Despite the changing season, Eleanor's life had settled into a rhythm she hadn't known she needed, a balance between solitude and slow, tentative reconnection. Her mornings began with coffee brewed over the small stove, the bitter aroma filling the cramped kitchen as she prepared for the day ahead. She continued her visits to the Legion Hall, the circle of veterans offering companionship and a sense of belonging she had long thought lost. Evenings found her by the fire, pen in hand, filling the pages of her worn journal with memories, reflections, and fragments of a life shaped by sacrifice. One chilly morning, as frost dusted the edges of her porch, a parcel arrived. It was unassuming, tied together with faded twine, the paper worn and creased as if it had traveled a long and winding road. Eleanor recognized the handwriting instantly. Her daughter's. The letters weren't new. They had been lost, misplaced during one of the many moves Eleanor had made after leaving the service. But somehow, they had found their way back to her now, delivered by a stranger who had heard whispers of Eleanor's story in town. Eleanor sat by the window, the pale light of dawn illuminating the delicate script as she untied the bundle. Each letter unfolded like a lifeline thrown across years of silence and distance. Claire's words were tender, full of love, regret, and a yearning to reconnect. There were apologies for missed birthdays, quiet confessions of fear and misunderstanding, and heartfelt thanks for the strength Eleanor had shown, even from afar. Claire wrote about her own struggles growing up without her mother, about the pride she carried for the woman who had been a hero in the shadows, and about the hope that one day they might rebuild what had been broken. As Eleanor read, the weight she had carried for so long, the loneliness, the guilt, the unspoken pain, began to ease just a little. The letters were more than words on paper. They were bridges across time and heartache, reaching out to mend the fractures life had dealt. She read late into the night, the fire crackling softly, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with memories. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside, the fragile warmth of healing took root. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to believe in a new beginning, not just for herself, but for the family she had left behind and longed to reclaim. The winter would be harsh, the road ahead uncertain. But the letters that returned to her were a promise that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal, and that love, no matter how distant, could find its way home. Winter's first snow had fallen softly over the dense pines surrounding Eleanor's cabin, cloaking the world in a blanket of pristine white silence. Inside, the crackling wood stove pushed back the chill, casting a golden glow that danced across the worn walls lined with photographs, medals, and memories. But beyond the warmth of the fire, a different kind of warmth was stirring deep within Eleanor's chest. A fragile hope, kindled by the bundle of letters from her daughter, Claire. For years, Eleanor had kept a part of herself locked away, burdened by the sacrifices she'd made, the distance she'd maintained, and the family ties frayed by time and circumstance. But now, those old letters, rediscovered and returned, had begun to mend something long broken. One crisp morning, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, Eleanor stepped out into the pale dawn, the snow crunching beneath her boots. She carried only a small bag, but it held the weight of a journey she had deferred for far too long. The bus that carried her from the solitude of her cabin to the nearest town was cold and crowded, but Eleanor sat quietly, eyes fixed on the window as the familiar landscape gave way to the unknown. Her destination wasn't merely a place on a map. It was a return to a part of herself she had long left behind, a reunion with her daughter and with the past that had shadowed so many years. The moment they saw each other was quiet, without fanfare or dramatic embraces. Claire stood in the modest station waiting area, her eyes reflecting a mixture of nervousness and hope. Eleanor approached slowly, and for a heartbeat, they simply looked, two women shaped by different battles but bound by blood. Their conversation unfolded naturally, like a river slowly finding its course. Claire spoke of her childhood, the challenges of growing up without a steady presence, the silent pride she held for her mother's sacrifices. She shared stories of her own struggles and triumphs, revealing a resilience that mirrored Eleanor's own. Eleanor listened, her heart aching and swelling with emotions she hadn't dared to name. When it was her turn, she shared fragments of her own story, the missions, the loss, the quiet strength it took to keep going when the world had turned its back. There were no demands for perfection, no expectations beyond understanding. They were two women bridging years of silence with patience, honesty, and a deep desire to heal. As the day turned to evening, the first steps toward reconciliation were made, small, steady, but powerful in their simplicity. Back in Chapel Ridge, Word of Eleanor's return began to weave through the community like a slow, steady tide. The veteran who had once been invisible was now embraced not only as a hero, but as a woman reclaiming her life, her family, and her place in a town that was learning to honor its past and those who carried it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentle and unrelenting, a quiet witness to a journey that was far from over, but no longer walked alone. Returning to Chapel Ridge had brought more than reunion and healing for Eleanor. It had stirred the shadows she thought she had long left behind. The quiet town, once indifferent or suspicious, was now a place where whispers traveled swiftly, words laced with judgment, curiosity, and at times, thinly veiled resentment. One crisp afternoon, Eleanor walked deliberately through the town square, her footsteps steady but aware of the eyes that followed her. The streets that had felt so distant and cold now felt alive with a tension she couldn't ignore. At the far edge of the square, leaning against the faded brick wall of the hardware store, stood Deputy Tolbert. His eyes narrowed when he saw her, a cold, hard gaze that reminded Eleanor of the day at the gas station when he had tried to intimidate her. The memory of that moment, sharp and bitter, rose unbidden. Tolbert's voice broke the silence first, low and sharp, carrying the weight of old grudges. "You don't belong here," he said, words heavy with accusation. Eleanor met his eyes without hesitation, her own gaze calm but unwavering. "I belong wherever I choose," she replied, voice steady, calm, the voice of someone who had faced down far worse than small-town spite. A hush fell over the gathered townsfolk nearby. Their faces were a mixture of surprise and quiet support. No one spoke, but their attention was locked on the silent standoff between woman and deputy. Tolbert's confident facade faltered. The certainty in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps fear. The moment stretched, heavy with tension. Before Tolbert could muster a retort, the sound of engines drew everyone's eyes to the street. Four black SUVs rolled into the square with quiet authority. The vehicles slowed to a stop, doors opening with deliberate precision. Clark and his team stepped out, disciplined, controlled, their presence commanding but not aggressive. These were soldiers of honor, men and women who understood the stakes and the power of presence without unnecessary conflict. Their eyes scanned the scene calmly, resting briefly on Eleanor before shifting to Tolbert. The deputy swallowed hard, the weight of unspoken threats pressing down on him. The crowd murmured, the tension shifting palpably. What had once been a place of doubt and dismissal was now transformed into a moment of recognition and respect. The silent arrival of Eleanor's allies sent a clear message. This was not a battle Tolbert could win with intimidation or arrogance. Eleanor stood tall, embodying the dignity and strength forged through years of sacrifice. She said nothing more. Her presence, backed by the disciplined resolve of those who had stood by her in the darkest hours, spoke volumes. In that quiet moment, past and present converged. The quiet veteran, once invisible and dismissed, reclaimed her place, not through violence, but through honor, truth, and an unshakable presence. The sun dipped low over Chapel Ridge, casting a warm amber glow that stretched across the sleepy town like a final embrace at the close of day. The black SUVs, which had quietly arrived that afternoon with disciplined precision, were now distant figures on the winding road, a silent but unmistakable testament to the change that had swept through the town. Their presence lingered in the air, an invisible shield of protection, solidarity, and respect. The townsfolk who had gathered earlier in the square were slowly returning to their routines, but their eyes held something new, a quiet reverence for a woman they had once ignored or dismissed. Eleanor, the veteran who had lived on the edges of their lives, invisible and overlooked, was now undeniably present in their collective consciousness. Eleanor stood still by the edge of town, tracing a gentle hand over the bronze star pinned carefully to her jacket. Its cold metal weight pressed against her chest, heavy not just with metal, but with the stories of battles fought in silence, the scars borne out of sight, and the lives lost. the unseen wounds carried by those who serve. Her mind drifted to the long years of service, the cold nights on foreign soil, the quiet camaraderie of her unit, the heartbreak of comrades lost too soon. She remembered the missions that had defined her, but never defined her completely. Those memories came with a quiet ache, tempered by pride and an unwavering sense of duty. But her thoughts didn't linger solely on the past. They turned to the present and the future, to the family she was slowly rebuilding. To Claire, her daughter, whose letters had been a lifeline, a bridge over years of silence and absence. To the circle of veterans at the Legion Hall, whose presence had reminded her she was never truly alone. Eleanor looked toward the horizon, where the mountains stood tall and unchanging against the deepening sky. The cold air filled her lungs, crisp and scented with pine and earth, a reminder of home and the promise of new beginnings. This was more than a place. It was a testament to quiet strength, resilience, and the power of honor reclaimed. It was proof that dignity is not granted by loud voices or public applause, but by the steadfast presence of those who carry their truths with humility and courage. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the journey behind her and the steady beat of hope ahead. The snow beneath her boots crunched softly, a steady rhythm marking the steps of a woman who had finally found her way back. The journey had been long and hard, marked by loss, struggle, and moments of deep loneliness. But now, Eleanor was home, not just in the place where she lived, but in the quiet knowledge that her story mattered, that her sacrifices had not been in vain, that she was seen, respected, and honored, not just as a veteran, but as a woman who had endured and triumphed. As the last light faded from the sky, Eleanor turned and walked back toward her cabin. The soft glow of the fire inside welcomed her, a beacon of warmth and peace. Outside, the world settled into night, but inside, a quiet victory was born. The victory of a veteran finally at rest, finally home. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive tactical stories.